What up, people? Mr. Marshmallow. Mr. Marshmallow, hello. How are you? Hi, Amanda. Oh, snap. Random live. You gotta be aware of those random lives, you know. It's not the planned lives where the real shenanigans happen. Yeah, there's some shenanigans that happen there, but it's these ones that you didn't expect me to come on live and here you fucking go. Mighty fine. My son is in his martial arts class, and I called the people that I had on my list to call, and I left my computers at home, and they didn't answer. And I left my computers at home, so you guys get to read a book with me. So I have been wanting to read some books to you guys. This one's actually a short one. It's way shorter than it looks because a lot of this is like big picture stuff. This is, if somebody were to ask me like about my spiritual journey and what books to read to help along a spiritual journey, this is one of the first ones actually that I didn't even read it. It was read to me when I was little, when I was like 5, 6, 7, I think. 7 was the big year. And I remember the way that it struck me. The book is called Jonathon Livingston Seagull. You too, Lost Bird. Hey, Bluebird. It's called Jonathon Livingston Seagull, and it's written by Richard Bach. He has such a profound, he has such a skilled way of saying really profound things in very plain, simple stories. And his stories are like these like fusion fiction, nonfiction things. They're nonfiction story, or they're fiction stories. But when you read them and you read into them and you read him in them, you realize how much nonfiction is really in there. They're just kind of under the guise of fiction. So you too, friend. Hatchet. Yes, I remember reading that one too. I read that. We had to read that in school. You read The Hobbit after? I've actually never read The Hobbit. I know. But I'm very much one like, I'm like a spiritual book person, learning book person. I struggle to read like big fiction. The Giving Tree. The Giving Tree was a really powerful one too, actually, because my mother was very clear with me about the Giving Tree and about kind of the interesting scenario, the martyrdom of the Giving Tree. This Giving Tree that gave and gave and gave until it had nothing, and then still gave, perked itself up just a little bit more so the little boy could come take a little bit more from it. And so, yeah, there are a lot of books, right? Thanks, Neurodivergent. Actually, it's right now. It's right now. Okay, I'm not the only one who hasn't read The Hobbit. I'm glad. So I thought that while we waited for my son, he's going to be in here for another hour at least. So I figured I would start reading through this book. And if you guys want to hang out. I'll show you the pictures. There's a lot of them. But we're talking about a seagull. Portal Master. We're talking about a seagull. So it's called Jonathon Livingston Seagull. I have not read The Dark Tower either, no. And it's by Richard Bach. Photographs by Russell Munson. Now, for those of you who have some years under your belt, hey Dreamy, thank you so much. This book was actually made into a film. I still haven't seen the film, but this book came out, I think, in the 70s, and early 70s, and there was a film about it, and for those of you who've seen it, I hear it's a pretty nice film, but the book, I prefer the book over the film, right? Okay, so let's get going. Settle in, plug your earplugs in, and put your earplugs in, and keep going with whatever you're doing during your day, as long as you can just listen in. All right. It was morning, and the new sun sparkled across the ripples of a gentle sea. A mile from shore, a fishing boat chummed the water, and the word for breakfast flock flashed through the air, till a crowd of 1,000 seagulls came to dodge and fight for bits of food. It was another busy day beginning. But way off alone, out by himself, beyond boat and shore Jonathon Livingston Seagull was practicing. 100 feet in the sky, he lowered his webbed feet, lifted his beak, and strained to hold a painful, hard, twisting curve through his wings. The curve meant that he would fly slowly. And now he slowed until the wind was a whisper in his face, until the ocean stood still beneath him. He narrowed his eyes in fierce concentration, held his breath, forced one single more inch of curve. Then his feathers ruffled. He stalled and fell. Seagulls, as you know, never falter, never stall. To stall in the air is for them to disgrace, and it is dishonor. But Jonathon Livingston Seagull, unashamed, stretching his wings again in that trembling hard curve, slowing, and stalling once more, was no ordinary bird. Texan CAYA. CAYA means come as you are, CAYA. Thanks, Claybeard. Love you too, friend. Most gulls didn't bother to learn more than the simplest facts of flight. How to get from shore to food and back. For most gulls, it is not flying that matters, but eating. For this gull, though, it was not eating that mattered, but flight. More than anything else, Jonathon Livingston Seagull loved to fly. This kind of thinking, he found, is not the way to make oneself popular with the other birds. Even his parents were dismayed as Jonathon spent whole days alone, making hundreds of low-level glides, experimenting. He didn't know why, for instance, but when he flew at altitudes less than half his wingspan above the water, he could stay in the air longer with less effort. His glides ended not with the usual feet-down splash into the sea, but with a long, flat wake as he touched the surface with his feet, tightly streamlined against his body. When he began sliding into feet-up landings on the beach, then pacing the length of his slide in the sand, his parents were very much dismayed indeed. "Why, John, why?" his mother asked. "Why is it so hard to be like the rest of the flock, John? Why can't you leave low-flying to the pelicans, the albatross? Why don't you eat, son, your bone and feathers?" "I don't mind being bone and feathers, Mom. I just want to know what I can do in the air and what I can't. That's all. I just want to know." "See here, Jonathon," said his father, not unkindly. "Winter isn't far away. Boats will be few, and the surface fish will be swimming deep. If you must study, then study food and how to get it. This flying business is all very well, but you can't eat a glide, you know. Don't you forget the reason you fly is to eat." Jonathon nodded obediently. For the next few days, he tried to behave like the other gulls. He really tried, screeching and fighting with the flock around the piers and fishing boats, diving on scraps of fish and bread. But he couldn't make it work. It's all so pointless, he thought, deliberately dropping a hard-won anchovy to a hungry gull chasing him. I wish I could be spending all this time learning to fly. There's so much to learn. It wasn't long before Jonathon Gull was off by himself again, far out at sea, hungry, happy, learning. The subject was speed, and in a week's practice he learned more about speed than the fastest gull alive. From 1,000 feet, flapping his wings as hard as he could, he pushed over into a blazing steep dive toward the waves and learned why gulls don't make blazing steep power dives. In just 6 seconds, he was moving 70 miles per hour, the speed at which one's wing goes unstable on the upstroke. Time after time it happened. Careful as he was, working at the very peak of his ability, he lost control at high speed. Because you got to see the pictures. Me too, Corinne. It's one of my favorites. I actually have a bunch of these seagulls directly from the book tattooed on me. Climb to 1,000 feet. full power straight ahead first, then push over, flipping into a vertical dive. Then, every time his left wing stalled on an upstroke, he'd roll violently left, stall his right wing, recovering, and flick like fire into a wild, tumbling spin to the right. He couldn't be careful enough on that upstroke. 10 times he tried, and all 10 times, as he passed through 70 miles per hour, he burst into a churning mass of feathers, out of control, crashing down into the water. Texan, we are reading Jonathon Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. The key, he thought at last, dripping wet, must be to hold the wings still at high speeds, to flap up to 50 and then hold the wings still. From 2,000 feet, he tried again, rolling into his dive, beak straight down, wings full out and stable from the moment he passed 50 miles per hour. It took tremendous strength, but it worked. In 10 seconds, he had blurred through 90 miles per hour. Jonathon had set a world speed record for seagulls. But victory was short-lived. The instant he began his pullout, the instant he changed the angle of his wings, he snapped into that same terrible, uncontrolled disaster, and at 90 miles per hour, it hit him like dynamite. Jonathon Seagull exploded in midair and smashed down into a brick-hard sea. When he came to, it was well after dark, and he floated in the moonlight on the surface of the ocean. His wings were ragged bars of lead, but the weight of failure was even heavier on his back. Thanks, Sphinx. He wished feebly that the weight could be just enough to drag him gently down to the bottom and end it all. As he sank low in the water, a strange, hollow voice sounded within him. There's no way around it. I am a seagull. I am limited by my nature. If I were meant to learn so much about flying, I'd have charts for brains. If I were meant to fly at speed, I'd have a falcon's short wings and live on mice instead of fish. My father was right. I must forget this foolishness. I must fly home to the flock and be content as I am, as a poor, limited seagull. The voice faded, and Jonathon agreed. The place for a seagull at night is on shore, and from this moment forth, he vowed he would be a normal gull. It would make everyone happier. He pushed wearily away from the dark water and flew toward land, grateful for what he had learned about work-saving, low-altitude flying. But no, he thought, I am done with the way I was. I am done with everything I learned. I am a seagull like every other seagull, and I will fly like one. So he climbed painfully to 100 feet and flapped his wings harder, pressing for shore. Hey, Chris. Do I feel limited? I recognize that my limitations are only an illusion, and that the whole game is to get yourself out of the illusion. He felt better for his decision to just be another one of the flock. There would be no ties now to the force that had driven him to learn. There would be no more challenge and no more failure. And it was pretty just to stop thinking and fly through the dark toward the lights of the beach. Dark! The hollow voice cracked in alarm. Seagulls never fly in the dark. Jonathon was not alert to listen. It's pretty, he thought, the moon and the lights twinkling on the water, throwing out little beacon trails through the night, and all so peaceful and still. Get down! Seagulls never fly in the dark. If you were meant to fly in the dark, you'd have the eyes of an owl, you'd have charts for brains, you'd have a falcon's short wings. There in the night, 100 feet in the air, Jonathon Livingston Seagull blinked. His pain, his resolutions, vanished. Short wings! A falcon's short wings! That's the answer. What a fool I've been. All I need is a tiny little wing. All I need is to fold most of my wings and fly on just the tips alone. Short wings. He climbed 2,000 feet above the Black Sea, and without a moment for thought of failure or death, he brought his forewings tightly into his body, left only the narrow swept daggers of his wing tips extended into the wind, and fell into a vertical dive. The wind was a monster roar in his head, 70 miles per hour, 90, 120, and faster still. The wing strain now at 140 miles per hour wasn't nearly as hard as it had been before at 70, and with the faintest twist of his wingtips, he eased out of the dive and shot above the waves, a gray cannonball under the moon. He closed his eyes to slits against the wind and rejoiced. 140 miles per hour and under control. If I dive from 5,000 feet instead of 2,000, I wonder how fast. His vows of a moment before were forgotten, swept away in that great swift wind. He felt guiltless, breaking the promises he had made himself. Such promises were only for the gulls that accept the ordinary. Such promises are only one who has touched excellence in his learning has no need for that kind of promise. By sunup, Jonathon Gull was practicing again. From 5,000 feet, the fishing boats were specks in the flat blue water. Breakfast flock was a faint cloud of dust motes circling. He was alive, trembling ever so slightly with delight, proud that his fear was under control. Then, without ceremony, he hugged his forewings, extended his short, angled wingtips, and plunged directly toward the sea. By the time he passed 4,000 feet, he had reached terminal velocity. The wind was a solid beating wall of sound against which he could move no faster. He was now flying straight down at 214 miles per hour. He swallowed, knowing that if his wings unfolded at that speed, he'd be blown into a million tiny shreds of seagull. But the speed was power, and the speed was joy, and the speed was pure beauty. He began his pullout at 1,000 feet, wingtips thudding and blurring in a gigantic wind, the boat and the crowd of gulls tilting and growing meteor fast directly in his path. He couldn't stop. He didn't yet know even how to turn at that speed. Collision would be instant death. And so he shut his eyes. It happened that morning, then, just after sunrise, that Jonathon Livingston Seagull fired directly through the center of the breakfast flock, taking off 212 miles per hour, eyes closed, in a great roaring shriek of wind and feathers. The gull of fortune smiled upon him this once, and no one was killed. By the time he had pulled his beak straight up into the sky, he was still scorching along at 160 miles per hour. When he had slowed to 20 and stretched his wings again, at last the boat was a crumb on the sea, 4,000 feet below. His thought was triumph. Terminal velocity, a seagull at 214 miles per hour. It was a breakthrough, the greatest single moment in history of the flock. And in that moment, a new age opened for Jonathon Gull. Flying to his lonely practice area, folding his wings for a dive from 8,000 feet, he set himself at once to discover how to turn. Because I'm waiting for my kid who's in MMA. A single wingtip feather, he found, moved a fraction of an inch, gives a smooth, creeping curve at tremendous speed. Before he learned this, however, he found that moving more than one feather at that speed will spin you like a rifle ball. And Jonathon had flown the first aerobatics of any seagull on Earth. Yeah, of course, Chris. He spared no time that day for talk with other gulls. He but flew on past sunset. He discovered the loop, the slow roll, the point roll, the inverted spin, the gull bunt, the pinwheel. When Jonathon Seagull joined the flock on the beach, it was full night. He was dizzy and terribly tired. Yet, in delight, he flew a loop to landing with a snap roll just before touching down. When they hear of it, he thought, of the breakthrough, they'll be wild with joy. How much more there is now to living. Instead of our drab slogging back and forth to the fishing boats, there is reason to live. We can lift ourselves out of ignorance. We can find ourselves as creatures of excellence and intelligence and skill. We can be free. We can learn to fly. I think one of the reasons this book really was so profound for me was that when I was a little girl, I was learning to fly in my dreams. And I would wake up each morning and attempt it from my bed because I was absolutely positive that I could fly. I felt it in my bones, felt it in my feathers. I'd ride in the car with my arm out, feeling the wind and tilting my hand on the wind. And when my mother first read this book to me, it made me cry. It's still going to make me cry anyway. The years ahead hummed and glowed with promise. Yeah. Okay. The years ahead hummed and glowed with promise. The gulls were flocked into the council gathering when he landed, and apparently had been so flocked for some time. They were, in fact, waiting. Mark, you jumped all the way out your window? I jumped from trees and my bed and stuff like that, but not out the window. How far? Okay. Jonathon Livingston Seagull. Wait. Hold on. That's a voice. Jonathon Livingston Seagull. Stand to center. The elder's words sounded in a voice of the highest ceremony. Stand to center meant only great shame or great honor. Stand to center for honor was the way the gull's foremost fathers were marked. Of course, he thought. The breakfast flock this morning, they saw the breakthrough, but I want no honors. I have no wish to be leader. I only want to share what I found to show these horizons out ahead for all of us. He stepped forward. Jonathon Livingston Seagull, said the elder. Stand to center for shame in the sight of your fellow gulls. It felt like being hit with a board. His knees went weak. His feathers sagged. There was a roaring in his ears. Centered for shame? Impossible. The breakthrough. They can't understand. They're wrong. They're wrong. For his reckless irresponsibility, the solemn voice intoned, violating the dignity and tradition of the gull family. To be centered for shame meant that he would be cast out of gull society, banished to a solitary life on the far cliffs. One day, Jonathon Livingston Seagull, you shall learn that irresponsibility does not pay. Life is the unknown and the unknowable, except that we are put into this world to eat, to stay alive as long as we possibly can. A seagull never speaks back to the council flock, but it was Jonathon's voice raised. Irresponsibility? My brothers, he cried. Who is more responsible than a gull who finds and follows a meaning? A higher purpose for life? For 1,000 years we have scrabbled after fish heads. But now we have a reason to live, to learn, to discover, to be free. Give me one chance. Let me show you what I have found. The flock might as well have been stone. The brotherhood is broken. The brotherhood is broken. The gulls intoned together, and with one accord, they solemnly closed their ears and turned their backs upon him. Jonathon Seagull spent the rest of his days alone, but he flew way out beyond the far cliffs. His one sorrow was not solitude. It was that the other gulls refused to believe the glory of flight that awaited them. They refused to open their eyes and see. He learned more each day. He learned that a streamlined, high-speed dive could bring him to find the rare and tasty fish that schooled 10 feet below the surface of the ocean. He no longer needed fishing boats and stale bread for survival. He learned to sleep in the air, setting a course at night across the offshore wind, covering 100 miles from sunset to sunrise with the same inner control. He flew through heavy sea fogs and climbed above them into dazzlingly clear skies. In the very times when every other gull stood on the ground, knowing nothing but mist and rain. He learned to ride the high winds far inland, to dine there on delicate insects. What he had once hoped for the flock, he now gained for himself alone. He learned to fly, and was not sorry for the price he had paid. Jonathon Seagull discovered that boredom and fear and anger are the reasons that a gull's life is so short. And with these gone from his thought, he lived a long, fine life indeed. Hey, Brian. We are reading Jonathon Livingston Seagull, written by Richard Bach. If you have not read this book, hang out. There's still more. There's the story. They came in the evening, then, and found Jonathon gliding peaceful and alone through his beloved sky. The 2 gulls that appeared at his wings were pure as starlight, and the glow from them was gentle and friendly in the high night air. But most lovely of all was the skill with which they flew, their wingtips moving at a precise and constant inch from his own. Without a word, Jonathon put them to the test, a test that no other gull had ever passed. He twisted his wings, slowed to a single mile per hour above stall. The 2 radiant birds slowed with him smoothly, locked in position. They knew about slow flying. Okay. He folded his wings, rolled, and dropped into a dive to 190 miles per hour. They dropped with him, streaking down in flawless formation. At last, he turned that speed straight up into a long vertical slow roll. They rolled with him, smiling. He recovered to a level flight and was quiet for a time before he spoke. "Very well," he said. "Who are you?" "We're from your flock, Jonathon. We are your brothers." The words were strong and calm. We've come to take you higher, to take you home. Home? I have none. Flock? I have none. I am outcast. And we fly now at the peak of the great mountain wind. Beyond a few 100 feet, I can lift this old body no higher. But you can, Jonathon, for you have learned. One school is finished, and the time has come for another to begin. As it had shined across him all his life, so understanding lighted that moment for Jonathon Seagull. They were right. He could fly no higher, and it was time to go home. He gave one last long look across the sky, across that magnificent silver land where he had learned so much. I'm ready, he said at last. And Jonathon Livingston Seagull rose with the 2 star-bright gulls to disappear into a perfect dark sky. Birds and part 2. And a sip. This story is like a silver lining. Oh, good. So, this is heaven, he thought, and he had to smile at himself. It was hardly respectful to analyze heaven in the very moment that one flies up to enter it. As he came from Earth now, above the clouds and in close formation with the 2 brilliant gulls, he saw that his own body was growing as bright as theirs. True, the same young Jonathon Seagull was there that had always lived behind his golden eyes, but the outer form had changed. It felt like a seagull body, but already it flew better than his old one had ever flown. Why, with half the effort, he thought, I'll get twice the speed, twice the performance of my best days on Earth. His feathers glowed brilliant white now, and his wings were smooth and perfect as sheets of polished silver. He began, delightedly, to learn about them, to press power into these new wings. At 250 miles per hour, he felt that he was nearing his level flight maximum speed. At 273, he thought he was flying as fast as he could fly, and he was ever so faintly disappointed. There was a limit to how much this new body could do, and though it was much faster than his old level flight record, it was still a limit that would take great effort to crack. In heaven, he thought, there should be no limits. The clouds broke apart. His escorts called, "Happy landings, Jonathon," and vanished into thin air. He was flying over a sea toward a jagged shoreline. A very few seagulls were working on the updrafts on the cliffs. Away off to the north, at the horizon itself, flew a few others. New sights, new thoughts, new questions. Why so few gulls? Heaven should be flocked with gulls. And why am I so tired all at once? Gulls in heaven are never supposed to be tired or to sleep. Hi, Tren. Where had he heard that? The memory of his life on Earth was falling away. Earth had been a place where he had learned much, of course, but the details were blurred. Something about fighting for food and being outcast. The dozen gulls by the shoreline came to meet him, none saying a word. He felt only that he was welcome, and that this was home. It had been a big day for him, a day whose sunrise he no longer remembered. He turned to land on the beach, beating his wings to stop an inch in the air, then dropping lightly to the sand. The other gulls landed too, but not one of them so much as flapped a feather. They swung into the wind, bright wings outstretched. Then somehow they changed the curve of their feathers until they had stopped in the same instant their feet touched the ground. It was beautiful control. But now Jonathon was too tired, just too tired to try it. Standing there on the beach, still, without a spoken word, he was asleep. In the days that followed, Jonathon saw that there was as much to learn about flight in this place as there had been in the life behind him, but with a difference. Here the gulls thought as he thought. For each of them, the most important thing in living was to reach out and touch perfection in that which they most loved to do, and that was to fly. They were magnificent birds, all of them, and they spent hour after hour every day practicing flight, testing advanced aeronautics. For a long time, Jonathon forgot about the world that he had come from, that place where the flock lived with its eyes tightly shut to the joy of flight, using its wings as means to the end of finding and fighting for food. But now and then, just for a moment, he remembered. He remembered it one morning when he was out with his instructor. While they rested on the beach after a session of folded wing snap rolls, "Where is everybody, Sullivan?" he asked silently. Quite at home now with the easy telepathy that these gulls used instead of screes and groks. "Why aren't there more of us here? Why, where I came from, there were..." "Thousands and thousands of gulls, I know." Sullivan shook his head. "The only answer I can see, Jonathon, is that you are pretty well 1 in a million bird. Most of us came along ever so slowly. We went from one world into another that was almost exactly like it, forgetting right away where we had come from, not caring where we were headed. Living for the moment. Do you have any idea how many lives we must have gone through before we even got the first idea that there was more to life than eating or fighting or power in the flock? 1,000 lives, John. 10,000. And then 100 lives until we began to learn that there is such a thing as perfection. And another 100 again to get the idea that our purpose for living is to find that perfection and show it forth. The same rule holds for us now, of course. We choose our next world through what we learn in this one. Learn nothing, and the next world is the same as this one. All the same limitations and lead weights to overcome. He stretched his wings and turned to face the wind. "But you, John," he said, "learned so much at one time that you didn't have to go through 1,000 lives to reach this one." In a moment, they were airborne again. Practicing the formation point rolls were difficult. It's okay. Through the inverted half, Jonathon had to think upside down, reversing the curve of his wings and reversing it exactly in harmony with his instructors. "Let's try it again," Sullivan said, over and over. "Let's try it again." Then finally, "Good." And they began practicing outside loops. One evening, the gulls that were not night flying stood together on the sand, thinking. Jonathon took all his courage in hand and walked to the elder gull, who, it was said, was soon to be moving beyond this world. "Chang," he said, a little nervously. The old seagull looked at him kindly. "Yes, my son." Instead of being enfeebled by age, the elder had been empowered by it. He could outfly any gull in the flock, and he had learned skills that the other gulls were only gradually coming to know. "Chang, this world isn't heaven at all, is it?" The elder smiled in the moonlight. "You are learning." Again, Jonathon Seagull, he said. "Well, what happens from here? Where are we going? Is there no such place as heaven?" "No, Jonathon, there is no such place. Heaven is not a place, and it is not a time. Heaven is being perfect." He was silent for a moment. You are a very fast flyer, aren't you? I enjoy speed, Jonathon said, taken aback but proud that the elder had noticed. You will begin to touch heaven, Jonathon, in the moment that you touch perfect speed. And that isn't flying 1,000 miles an hour, or 1,000,000, or flying at the speed of light, because any number is a limit. And perfection doesn't have limits. Perfect speed, my son, is being there. Without warning, Chang vanished and appeared at the water's edge 50 feet away, all in the flicker of an instant. Then he vanished again and stood in the same millisecond at Jonathon's shoulder. It's kind of fun, he said. More seagulls. Still more seagulls. And there's the words. Jonathon was dazzled. He forgot to ask about heaven. How do you do that? What does it feel like? How far can you go? You can go to any place and to any time that you wish to go, the elder said. I've gone nearly everywhere and every when I can think of. He looked across the sea. It's strange. The gulls who scorn perfection for the sake of travel go nowhere slowly. Those who put aside travel for the sake of perfection go anywhere instantly. Remember, Jonathon, heaven isn't a place or a time, because place and time are so very meaningless. Heaven is... Can you teach me to fly like that? Jonathon Seagull trembled to conquer the unknown. Of course, if you wish to learn. I wish. When can we start? We could start now, if you'd like. I want to learn to fly like that, Jonathon said, and a strange light glowed in his eyes. Tell me what to do. Chang spoke slowly and watched the younger gull ever so carefully. To fly as fast as thought. To anywhere that is, he said. You must begin by knowing that you have already arrived. The trick, according to Chang, was for Jonathon to stop seeing himself as trapped inside a limited body that had 42-inch wingspan and performance that could be plotted on a chart. The trick was to know that his true nature lived as perfect as an unwritten number, everywhere at once, across space and time. Definitely. Jonathon kept at it, fiercely, day after day, from before sunrise till past midnight. And for all his effort, he moved not a feather width from his spot. Forget about faith, Chang said it time and again. You didn't need faith to fly. You needed to understand flying. This is just the same. Now, try again. Eric, that's what I came on saying. My mother read this to me when I was going through my spiritual awakening, actually, and it was really profound for me. I've read this book 1,000,000 times in my life. Then, one day, Jonathon, standing on the shore, closing his eyes, concentrating, all in a flash, knew what Chang had been telling him. true. I am a perfect, unlimited gull. He felt a great shock of joy. Good, Chang said, and there was victory in his voice. Jonathon opened his eyes. He stood alone with the elder on a totally different seashore. Trees down to the water's edge, twin yellow suns turning overhead. At last, you've got the idea, said Chang, but your control needs a little work. Chris, stick around. I will read you all the books I have. I'm sitting here like yeah. It gets me every single time too. Hang out if you want a good cry. Jonathon was stunned. Where are we? Utterly unimpressed with the strange surroundings, the elder brushed the question aside. We're on some planet, obviously, with a green sky and a double star for a sun. Jonathon made a scream of delight, the first sound he had made since he had left Earth. It works! Well, of course it works, John, said Chang. It always works when you know what you're doing. Now, about your control. By the time they returned, it was dark. The other gulls looked at him with awe in their golden eyes, for they had seen him disappear from where he had been rooted for so long. He stood there, congratulations, for less than a minute. I'm the newcomer here. I'm just beginning. It is I who must learn from you. I wonder about that, John, said Sullivan, standing near. You have less fear of learning than any gull I've seen in 10,000 years. The flock fell silent, and Jonathon fidgeted, embarrassed. We can start working on with time, if you wish, Chang said, till you can fly past the past and into the future. And then you will be ready to begin the most difficult and the most powerful and the most fun of all. You will be ready to begin to fly up and know the meaning of kindness and of love. A month went by, or something that felt about like a month, and Jonathon learned at a tremendous rate. He always had learned quickly from ordinary experience, and now, the special student of the elder himself, he took in new ideas like a streamlined, feathered computer. But then the day came that Chang vanished. He had been talking quietly with them all, exhorting them never to stop their learning and their practicing and their striving to understand more of the perfect, invisible principle of all life. Then, as he spoke, his feathers went brighter and brighter, and at last turned so brilliant that no gull could look upon him. Jonathon, he said, and these were the last words that he spoke. Keep working on love. When they could see again, Chang was gone. As the days went past, Jonathon found himself thinking time and again of the earth from which he had come. If he had known there just a tenth, just 100th of what he knew here, how much more life would have meant. He stood on the sand and fell to wondering if there was a gull back there who might be struggling to break out of his limits, to see the meaning of flight beyond a way of travel, to get a breadcrumb from a rowboat. Perhaps there might even have been one made outcast for speaking his truth in the face of the flock. And the more Jonathon practiced his kindness lessons, and the more he worked to know the nature of love, the more he wanted to go back to Earth For in spite of his lonely past, Jonathon Seagull was born to be an instructor, and his own way of demonstrating love was to give something of the truth that he had seen to a gull who asked only a chance to see the truth for himself. Sullivan, adept now at thought, speed, flight, and helping the others to learn, was doubtful. John, you were outcast once. Why do you think that any of the gulls in your old time would listen to you now? You know the proverb, and it's true. The gull sees farthest who flies highest. Those gulls where you came from are standing on the ground, squawking and fighting among themselves. They're 1,000 miles from heaven. And you say you want to show them heaven from where they stand? John, they can't see their own wingtips. Stay here. Help the new gulls here, the ones who are high enough to see what you have to tell them. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What if Chang had gone back to his old worlds? Where would you have been today?" The last point was a telling one, and Sullivan was right. The gull who sees the furthest, who flies the highest. Jonathon stayed and worked with the new birds coming in, who were all very bright and quick with their lessons, but the old feeling came back. And he couldn't help but think that there might be 1 or 2 gulls back on Earth who would be able to learn too. How much more would there have been now? How much more would he have known by now if Chang had come to him on the day that he was outcast? "Sully, I must go back," he said at last. "Your students are doing well. They can help you bring the newcomers along." Sullivan sighed, but he did not argue. "I think I'll miss you, Jonathon," was all he said. "Hey, Diana." "Sully, for shame," Jonathon said in reproach. "And don't be foolish. What are we trying to practice every day? If our friendship depends on things like space and time, then when we finally overcome space and time, we've destroyed our own brotherhood. But overcome space, and all we have left is here. Overcome time, and all we have left is now. And in the middle of here and now, don't you think we might see each other once or twice?" Sullivan Seagull laughed in spite of himself. "You crazy bird," he said kindly. "If anybody can show someone on the ground how to see 1,000 miles, it will be Jonathon Livingston Seagull." He looked at the sand. "Goodbye, John, my friend." "Goodbye, Sully. We'll meet again." And with that, Jonathon held in thought an image of the great gull flocks on the shore of another time, and he knew with practiced ease that he was not bone and feather, but a perfect idea of freedom and flight, limited by nothing. Fletcher Lind Seagull was still quite young, but already he knew that no bird had ever been so harshly treated by any flock, or with so much injustice. Yes, Diana, we are reading Jonathon Livingston Seagull. Oh, hold on just a sec. My son's getting in the car. Oh, it's okay, dog. It's okay. Come here, dog. Come on. Ajna, come here. Come here. Up in the back. Sorry, guys, for the commotion. Hold on. Here. Thank you. Okay. Come on in, honey. Thank you.
You too.
middle of the book. Okay? Okay. I don't care what they say, he thought fiercely, and his vision blurred as he flew out towards the far cliffs. There's so much more to flying than just flapping around from place to place. A mosquito does that. One little barrel roll around the elder goal, just for fun, and I'm outcast. Are they blind? Can't they see? Can't they think of the glory that it'll be when they really learn to fly? I don't care what they think. I'll show them what flying is. I'll be pure outlaw. If that's the way they want it, and I'll make them sorry. The voice came inside his own head, and though it was very gentle, it startled him so much that he faltered and stumbled in the air. Don't be harsh on them, Fletcher Seagull. In casting you out, the other gulls have only hurt themselves. And one day they will know this, and one day they will see what you see. Forgive them, and help them to understand. An inch from his right wingtip flew the most brilliant white gull in all the world, gliding effortlessly along, not moving a feather, at what was very nearly Fletcher's top speed. There was a moment of chaos in the young bird. What's going on? Am I mad? Am I dead? What is this? Low and calm, the voice went on within his thought, demanding an answer. Fletcher Lind Seagull, do you want to fly? Yes, I want to fly. Fletcher Lind Seagull, do you want to fly so much that you will forgive the flock and learn and go back to them one day and work to help them know? There was no lying to this magnificent, skillful being, no matter how proud or how hurt a bird was Fletcher Seagull. I do, he said softly. Then Fletch, that bright creature said to him, and the voice was very kind. Let's begin with level flight. So many seagulls. Part 3. Jonathan circled slowly over the far cliffs, watching. This rough, young Fletcher gull was very nearly a perfect flight student. He was strong and light and quick in the air, but far and away more important, he had a blazing drive to learn to fly. Thank you guys for the gifts. Here he came this minute, a blurred gray shape roaring out of a dive, flashing 150 miles per hour past his instructor. He pulled abruptly into another try at a 16-point vertical slow roll, calling the points out loud. 8, 9, 10. See, Jonathan, I'm running out of airspeed. 11. I want good sharp stops like yours. 12. But blast it, I just can't make 13. These last 3 points without 14. Ah! Fletcher's whip stall at the top was all the worse for his rage and fury at falling. He fell backward, tumbled, slammed savagely into an inverted spin, and recovered at last, panting, 100 feet below his instructor's level. You're wasting your time with me, Jonathan. I'm too dumb. I'm too stupid. I try, but I'll never get it. Jonathon Seagull looked down at him and nodded. You'll never get it for sure as long as you make that pull-up so hard. Fletcher, you lost 40 miles an hour in the entry. You have to be smooth. Firm, but smooth. Remember? He dropped down to the level of the younger gull. Let's try it together. Let's try it together now, in formation. And pay attention to that pull-up. It's a smooth, easy entry. By the end of 3 months, Jonathan had 6 other students, outcasts all, yet curious about his strange new idea of flight for the joy of flying. Still, it was easier for them to practice high performance than it was to understand the reason behind it. Each of us is, in truth, an idea of the great gull, an unlimited idea of freedom, Jonathan would say in the evenings on the beach. And precision flying is a step toward expressing our real nature. Everything that limits us, we have to put aside. That's why all this high-speed practice and low-speed aerobatics, and his students would be asleep, exhausted from the day's flying. They liked the practice because it was fast and exciting, and it fed a hunger for learning that grew with every lesson. But not one of them, not even Fletcher Lind Gull, had come to believe that the flight of ideas could possibly be as real as the flight of wind and feather. Your whole body, from wingtip to wingtip, Jonathan would say other times, is nothing more than your thought itself in a form that you can see. Break the chains of your thought and you break the chains of your body too. But no matter how he said it, it sounded like pleasant fiction and they needed more sleep. It was only a month later that Jonathan said that time had come to return to the flock. "We're not ready," said Henry Calvin Gull. "We're not welcome. We're outcasts. We can't force ourselves to go back where we're not welcome. Can we? We're free to go where we wish and to be what we are," Jonathan answered, and he lifted from the sand and turned east toward the home grounds of the flock. There was brief anguish among his students, for it is the law of the flock that an outcast never returns, and the law had not been broken once in 10,000 years. The law said stay. Jonathan said go. And by now he was a mile across the water. If they waited much longer, he would reach the hostile flock alone. "Well, we don't have to obey the law if we're not part of the flock, do we?" Fletcher said, rather self-consciously. "Besides, if there's a fight, we'll be a lot more help there than here." And so they flew in from the west that morning, 8 of them, in double diamond formation, wingtips almost overlapping. They came across the flock's council beach at 135 miles per hour. Jonathan in the lead, Fletcher smoothly at his right, Henry Calvin struggling gamely at his left. Then the whole formation rolled slowly to the right as one bird, level, 2, inverted, 2, level, the wind whipping over all of them. The squawks and grockles of the everyday life in the flock were cut off as though the formation were a giant knife and 8,000 gull eyes watched without a single blink. One by one, each of the 8 birds pulled sharply upward to a full loop and flew all the way around to a dead slow stand-up landing on the sand. Then, as though this sort of thing happened every day, Jonathon Seagull began to critique of the flight. "To begin with," he said with a wry smile, "you were a little bit late on the join-up. It went like lightning through the flock. Those birds are outcast. And they have returned. And that can't happen." Fletcher's predictions of battle melted in the flock's confusion. "Well, sure, okay, they're outcasts," said some of the younger gulls, "but hey, man, where did they learn to fly like that?" It took almost an hour for the word of the elder to pass through the flock. Ignore them. The gull who speaks to them to an outcast is an outcast himself. And the gull who looks upon an outcast breaks the law of the flock. Gray feathered backs were turned upon Jonathon from that moment onward. He didn't appear to notice. He held his practice sessions directly over the council beach, and for the first time began pressing his students to the limit of their ability. "Martin Gull," he shouted across the sky, "you say you know low-speed flying. You know nothing till you prove it. Fly!" So quiet little Martin William Seagull, startled to be caught under his instructor's fire, surprised himself and became a wizard of low speeds. In the lightest breeze, he could curve his feathers to lift himself without a single flap of wing from sand to cloud and down again. Likewise, Charles Roland Gull flew the great mountain wind to 24,000 feet, came down blue from cold, thin air, amazed and happy, determined to go still higher tomorrow. Fletcher Seagull, who loved aerobatics like no one else, conquered his 16-point vertical slow roll, and the next day topped it off with a triple cartwheel, his feathers flashing white sunlight to a beach from which more than one furtive eye watched. Furtive. Every hour, Jonathon was there at the side of each of his students, demonstrating, suggesting, pressuring, guiding. He flew with them through night and cloud and storm for the sport of it, while the flock huddled miserably on the ground. When the flying was done, the students relaxed on the sand, and in time they listened more closely to Jonathon. He had some crazy ideas that they couldn't understand, but then he had some good ones that they could. Gradually in the night, another circle formed around the circle of students. A circle of curious gulls listening in the darkness for hours on end, not wishing to see or be seen of one another, fading away before daybreak. It was a month after the return that the first gull of the flock crossed the line and asked to learn how to fly. In his asking, Terence Lowell Gull became a condemned bird, labeled outcast, and the 8th of Jonathon's students. The next night, from the flock came Kirk Maynard Gull, wobbling across the sand, dragging his left wing to collapse at Jonathon's feet. "Help me," he said very quietly, speaking in the way that the dying speak. "I want to fly more than anything else in the world." "Come along, then," said Jonathon. "Climb with me away from the ground, and we'll begin." "You don't understand. My wing. I can't move my wing." "Maynard Gull, you have the freedom to be yourself, your true self, here and now, and nothing can stand in your way. It is the law of the great gull, the law that is." "Are you saying I can fly?" "I say you are free." As simply and as quickly as that, Kirk Maynard Gull spread his wings effortlessly and lifted into the dark night air. The flock was roused from their sleep by his cry, as loud as he could scream it from 500 feet up. "I can fly! Listen, I can fly!" By sunrise, there were nearly 1,000 birds standing outside the circle of students, looking curiously at Maynard. They didn't care whether they were seen or not, and they listened, trying to understand Jonathon Seagull. He spoke of very simple things, that it is right for a gull to fly, that freedom is the very nature of his being, that whatever stands against that freedom must be set aside, be it ritual or superstition or limitation in any form. "Set aside," came a voice from the multitude. even if it be the law of the flock? The only true law is that which leads to freedom, Jonathon said. There is no other. How do you expect us to fly as you fly? Came another voice. You are special and gifted and divine and above other birds. Look at Fletcher, Lowell, Charles Rowland, Judy Lee. Are they also special and gifted and divine? No more than you are, no more than I am. The only difference, the very only one, is that they have begun to understand what they really are and have begun to practice it. His students, save Fletcher, shifted uneasily. They hadn't realized that this was what they were doing. The crowd grew larger every day, coming to question, to idolize, to scorn. They are saying that in the flock, that if you are not the son of the great, that if you are not the great son of the gull himself, Fletcher told Jonathon one morning after advanced speed practice, then you are 1,000 years ahead of your time. Jonathon sighed. The price of being misunderstood, he thought. They call you devil or they call you God. What do you think, Fletch? Are we ahead of our time? A long silence. Well, this kind of flying has always been here to be learned by anybody who wanted to discover it. That's got nothing to do with time. We're ahead of the fashion, maybe. Ahead of the way most gulls fly. That's something, Jonathon said, rolling to glide inverted for a while. That's not half as bad as being ahead of our time. There is a fancy chair back there. It's a bar stool. It happened just a week later. Fletcher was demonstrating the elements of high-speed flying to a class of new students. He had just pulled out of his dive from 7,000 feet, a long gray streak firing a few inches above the beach, when a young bird on its first flight glided directly into his path, calling for its mother. With 1/10 of a second to avoid the youngster, Fletcher limbed Seagull snapped hard to the left at something over 200 miles per hour into a solid cliff of solid granite. It was, for him, as though the rock were a giant hard door into another world. A burst of fear and shock and black as he hit, and then he was adrift in a strange, strange sky, forgetting, afraid and sad and sorry, terribly sorry. The voice came to him as it had in the first day that he had met Jonathon Livingston Seagull. The trick, Fletcher, is that we are trying to overcome our limitations in order, patiently. We don't tackle flying through rock until a little later in the program. Jonathon, also known as the son of the great gull, his instructor said dryly. What are you doing here? The cliff. Didn't I die? Oh, Fletch, come on. Think. If you were talking to me now, then obviously you didn't die, did you? What you did manage to do was change your level of consciousness, rather abruptly. It's your choice now. You can stay here and learn on this level, which is quite a bit higher than the one you left, by the way. Or you can go back and keep working with the flock. The elders were hoping for some kind of disaster, but they're startled that you obliged them so well. There's the story. I want to go back to the flock, of course. I've barely begun with the new group. Very well, Fletcher. Remember what we were saying about one's body being nothing more than thought itself? Fletcher shook his head and stretched his wings and opened his eyes at the base of the cliff, in the center of the flock assembled. There was a great clamor of squawks and screes from the crowd when he first moved. "He lives! He that was dead lives! Touched him with a great wing-tip, brought him to life, the son of the great gull." "No, he denies it. He's a devil. Devil, come to break the flock." There were 4,000 gulls in the crowd, frightened at what had happened, and the cry, "Devil," went through them like the wind of an ocean storm. Eyes glazed, beaks sharp, they closed in to destroy. "Would you feel better if we left, Fletcher?" asked Jonathan. "I certainly wouldn't object to it if we did." Instantly they stood together a half-mile away, and the flashing beaks of the mob closed on empty air. Why is it, Jonathan puzzled, that the hardest thing in the world is to convince a bird that he is free, and that he can prove it for himself if he just spend a little time practicing? Why should that be so hard? Fletcher still blinked from the change of scene. "What did you just do? How did we get here?" "You said you wanted to be out of the mob, didn't you?" "Yes, but how did you..." "Like everything else, Fletcher. Practice." By morning, the flock had forgotten its insanity, but Fletcher had not. "Jonathan, remember what you said a long time ago about loving the flock enough to return to it and help it learn?" "Sure." "I don't understand how you manage to love a mob of birds that has just tried to kill you." "Oh, Fletch, you don't love that. You don't love hatred and evil, of course. You have to practice and see the real gull, the good in every one of them, and to help them see it in themselves. That's what I mean by love. It's fun when you get the knack of it. I remember a fierce young bird, for instance, Fletcher Livingston Seagull, his name, just been made outcast, ready to fight the flock to the death, getting a start on building his own bitter hell out on the far cliffs. And here he is today, building his own heaven instead, and leading the whole flock in that direction." Fletcher turned to his instructor, and there was a moment of fright in his eye. "Me? Leading? What do you mean, me leading? You're the instructor here. You couldn't leave." "Couldn't I? Don't you think that there might be other flocks, other Fletchers, and that need an instructor more than this one that's on his way toward the light?" "Me? John, I'm just a plain seagull. And you're..." "The only son of the great gull, I suppose." Jonathan sighed and looked out to sea. "You don't need me any longer. You need to keep finding yourself. A little more each day. That real, unlimited Fletcher Seagull. He's your instructor. You need to understand him and to practice him." A moment later, Jonathan's body wavered in the air, shimmering, and began to go transparent. "Don't let them spread silly rumors about me or make me a god, okay, Fletch? I'm a seagull. I like to fly, maybe." "Jonathan!" "Poor Fletch. Don't believe what your eyes are telling you. All they show is limitation. Look with your understanding. Find out what you already know, and you'll see the way to fly. The shimmering stopped. Jonathon Seagull had vanished into empty air. After a time, Fletcher Gull dragged himself into the sky and faced a brand new group of students, eager for their first lesson. To begin with, he said heavily, you've got to understand that a seagull is an unlimited idea of freedom, an image of the great gull, and your whole body, from wingtip to wingtip, is nothing more than your thought itself. The young gulls looked at him quizzically. Hey man, they thought, this doesn't sound like a rule for a loop. Fletcher sighed and started over. Very well, he said, and eyed them critically. Let's begin with level flight. And saying that, he understood all at once that his friend had, quite honestly, been no more divine than Fletcher himself. No limits, Jonathon, he thought. Well, then, the time's not distant when I'm going to appear out of thin air on your beach and show you a thing or two about flying. And though he tried to look properly severe for his students, Fletcher Seagull suddenly saw them all as they really were for just a moment. And he more than liked, he loved what it was he saw. No limits, Jonathon, he thought, and he smiled. His race to learn had begun. You can put this one on the back of your toilet. That's where I kept it for years. Jonathon Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. It's a fiction story. But read it again. And again. And again. And again. Your entire body, from wingtip to wingtip, is nothing more than thought itself. All right, I'm gonna go take my kid to grab a slice of pizza. He goes, Laura, hey, welcome. So I will be making a habit of coming on more and doing more reading. I might even eventually schedule an actual time for it, but keep your eyes peeled. Thanks for sitting with me. Thanks for listening. I love you guys. For those of you, oh shit. We have an astrology live here in 15 minutes. We have to go home. I'll get you pizza. Okay, guys. If you're a subscriber, Astrology Live is going to be probably like 10, 15 minutes late as we drive home. Okay, Astrology Live Natal Dive is happening shortly after 6 o'clock, and that's for subscribers only. If you want to subscribe right here, right now, go ahead and do it so you get the subscriber only live where we dive into your natal chart and do some deep dive astrology. And if you don't subscribe now, you can do so while I'm live too, but it is a closed live. There will be no previews. That way we can talk about private stuff in there. Okay, now I'm going to go. I love you guys. I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.